Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is a screencast-o-matic presentation and recording for the part of the lesson that has us looking at imperialism in Japan. Before we get started, please let me encourage you to open up to today's lesson, scroll down the correct section, and get ready to fill in the blanks with the guided notes sections, with the correct content that corresponds with this presentation. Please also remember that you have to answer the critical thinking questions that are conveyed throughout the lesson too. Let's go ahead and get started, and remember that you can replay any part of this presentation for detail, clarity, or repetition. Imperialism in Japan. Essential question: what was the impact of Western imperialism on Japan? Well, Western imperialism in Asia dramatically changed Japan forever. Ancient Japan was a territory divided by clans that borrowed ideas from China, like Buddhism, emperors, writing, and architecture. By the mid-11th century, Japanese feudalism began. Now, the emperor had little power, and Japan was ruled by regional landowners called daimyo. The daimyo were served by loyal warriors called samurai. This system of feudalism would last for a long period of time. And from 1192 to 1867, Japan was ruled by military dictators called shoguns. As depicted here, the shoguns were above the daimyo, but below the emperor. From 1560 to 1600, three powerful shoguns unified Japan: Nobunaga, Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Tokugawa Ieyasu unified Japan in 1600 and created a strong line of succession called the Tokugawa shogunate that ruled Japan until 1867. Now, European merchants and missionaries first arrived in Japan in the mid-1500s. Japanese shoguns enjoyed trade with Europeans and were fascinated by their military and their technologies. But the rapid conversion of Japanese to Christianity worried the Tokugawa, who banned Christianity in 1619. Additionally, to protect Japan from European influences, Tokugawa shogunate banned all foreign merchants and missionaries. By 1639, Japan adopted a closed country policy, and Japan entered an era of isolation that lasted for 200 years. During this era of isolation, the Japanese allowed one port at Teshima in Nagasaki Bay to remain open, but only to the Dutch and Chinese merchants. The Japanese did more than trade with the Dutch, though. They also learned from them about new Western ideas. These Dutch studies helped Japan learn about some of the new scientific and industrial technologies in Europe, like the steam engine in 1845 and the railroad, and additionally the steamboat and the electric battery. Also, let's not forget about the microscope and the anatomy book, too. From 1640 to 1853, Japan was isolated while the rest of Asia became imperialized by Western powers. In the early 1800s, Britain, France, Russia, and USA tried to negotiate the trade rights in Japan. Of course, with minimal success, because the Japanese repeatedly refused Western trade. In 1853, though, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in Tokyo Harbor with 4 well-armed steamships, and he demanded that the Japanese trade with the USA. Let's go ahead and do critical thinking decision number 1, the arrival of Americans in 1853. You will see here that on our doc we have a few questions we have to answer, so let's go ahead and do this one together. Beginning in the early 19th century, Westerners tried to convince the Japanese to open their ports to trade. British, French, Russian, and American officials occasionally anchored off the Japanese coast. Like China, however, Japan repeatedly refused to receive them. Then in 1853, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry took 4 ships into what is now Tokyo Harbor. These massive black wooden ships powered by steam astounded the Japanese. The ships' cannons also shocked them. The Tokugawa shogun realized they had no choice but to receive Perry, and letter Perry had brought the U.S. President Millard Fillmore. Fillmore's letter politely asked the shogun to allow free trade between the United States and Japan, and Perry delivered it with a threat, however, that he would come back with a larger fleet in a year to receive Japan's reply. What should the Japanese do? Continue to reject America's demand for trade and maintain isolation from Western powers? Prepare samurai warriors for war when the Americans return in 1854? Or realize Japan is overpowered and accept America's trade request? Or seek China's advice on how to resist imperialists and form an alliance with other Asian nations? Well, of course, as you may or may not know, the Japanese would later choose to enact on letter C, for reasons which will make more sense later when you proceed to the next part of the presentation. Please move on to part 2 of our presentation.